Well, good morning, everybody, and welcome to today's free webinar brought to you by ADDO about advertising signage, the good, the bad, and the ugly. Today, we've got you for an hour and we would like to take you through some experiences that we've had with outdoor advertising, and I'm joined today by my colleague in the business, Matthew Gilbertson. Good morning, Matthew.
Good morning, John, and good morning, everybody.
Now, Matt, I think, is driving the slides, so we might just start, and I hope everybody can see us coming through clearly. My name's John Glossop, and I'm the founder and director of ADDO. ADDO is a specialist training provider that provides training services to people in the property development sector, and I'm joined today by Matthew Gilbertson. Matthew Gilbertson's a senior associate at Glossop Town Planning, and Matthew and I have prepared today's session for you, which we hope you enjoy. Today is our largest ever audience for one of these webinar series events, so welcome to everybody out there. No doubt we've got such an enormous audience today because we're all stuck at home in stage 4 lockdown, which I'm struggling to deal with, frankly, although others are probably coping with it better than I am. But to all of you out there, I hope you are all well and safe, and my best to you and your families. By way of a short disclaimer, our planning business, Glossop Town Planning, does do work for outdoor advertising companies, and indeed Matthew has been working with a very prominent client in that space for a number of years now. But on the other hand too, we've also represented councils at VCAT in appeals where we've been asked to oppose applications for outdoors. So hopefully today we take a balanced look at this topic. Moving on to today's agenda, these are the sorts of things that that we would like to cover. Oh, pardon me, before we do that, I also wanted to do a little plug for ADDO. We've got some upcoming programs, and what better time to use an opportunity to plug programs than doing an advertising signage training program. The first one that we've got coming up is our Learn the Lingo, Identifying Architectural Styles and Terms. That's presented by David Cook, and that's going to start on the 17th of September. The second one is Heritage for the Future, Heritage Conservation for Built Environment Professionals, and Carolyn Baker from Bryce Rayworth's office will be facilitating that program. That's due to start on the 9th of October. The last one that we're doing is Plant It Up, Landscape Plan Assessment for Built Environment Professionals, and this will be run by Steve Schutt and Castile Shep from Hanson Partnership, both very experienced landscape architects and experts in their field, and that will be running on the 25th of November 2020. Now, as part of that, we will be offering a special opportunity to the first 10 registrants who book a place in one of those 3 courses after today's session, and they will be invited to participate in a new service that we're about to deliver called ADDO Coach. To be part of ADDO Coach, be one of the first people to be part of ADDO Coach, make sure you register for one of those courses, and we'll send you information on how you can be part of the ADDO Coach session. If you'd like more information on ADDO Coach, just simply contact us at addo.net.au. Now, today's agenda. We're going to do a bit of a world tour and a history of signage. We're going to look at how signage has shaped our cities from an historical and built form perspective. We're going to talk about the different types of signs that we'll see in our urban environment. And then we're going to move on to an understanding of the role of the decision guidelines in the various signage policies and provisions in the planning scheme, and how to appropriately exercise discretion when we're considering applications for signage that are either we're lodging as a consultant firm or we're assessing in our role as a council planner. All right, Matt, over to you.
Thanks, John. All right, good morning again, everybody. I'm going to take you through the first part of today's session, and I'm going to focus on a bit of the history around signage, and then take you through some of the signage matters in terms of land use terms and those kinds of things. So today we will be largely focusing on promotional signs, or major promotion signs, given that they are more contentious in nature in planning. Certainly we have regulations around all sorts of signs, but it's probably fair to say that promotional signs, major promotional signs, and in terms of emerging technology, electronic signs, the more contentious signs that we see in our built environment and in terms of our planning regulation as well. We're going to assume in today's session that you have a general level of familiarity with clause 5205, and we're not necessarily going to be taking you in detail through the provision itself. Instead, our focus is going to be on various issues associated with signage and its history. Please let us know any questions you have along the way in the Q&A box, and we'll try and answer as many as we can, both through the chat or towards the end of the session when we have a bit of a Q&A session as well. So please do feed them through as we go. And so to a bit of the history around signage, and signage is not a new phenomenon, and it's really something that is a tale as old as human civilization itself. And really that's not surprising when you think that mostly what advertising signs are trying to do is to communicate a message. And that message might simply be information such as, you know, this shop is the baker, it's the butcher, it's the candlestick maker. Or it might be promotional in nature, designed to persuade somebody who is reading that message or reading that sign to buy a particular product or a particular service. And signage emerged in the early days of Greek, Roman and Egyptian societies, predominantly in the form of trade signs. That is, businesses that would put objects or carvings out on their front walls or on their window, in their window frames, on their exterior, to signify to what at the time was a largely illiterate society where businesses were located and what types of product they offered. This imagery was kind of as simple as using vine leaves hanging out the side of entrances to signify that a business sold wine, for instance. And many of you are probably familiar with you know, hipster barber shops on Smith Street or other places like that that might have red and white barber poles that spin around out the front of their businesses. And those barber poles have their origin in the Middle Ages, from a time when barbers also provided dentistry and surgical services. And again, that was to indicate to members of that society that those businesses were there and that they could seek treatment from those types of places. Signage was mostly an optional exercise, that is, that businesses decided when and if they wanted to include signs, but at the front of their business. But regulation of signage began as early as the 1300s. And so King Richard II required that all English alehouses and taverns must have a sign out the front of their business so that the ale conner, that's the official ale taster of a town, knew where to step in to examine beer and ale to ensure that it was good and wholesome and sold at the proper prices. And while that might seem like it would have been a nice job to have, apparently it wasn't at the time, given that there was varying quality of alcohol and it could cause sickness and death in many cases. Proper regulation of signage in terms of its location and how it's presented really began with industrial booms in the 1800s, and England and France both introduced laws that signs needed to be fixed flat to a wall along a path or a roadway. And the reason why that kind of legislation was introduced was to prevent horse-drawn carriages knocking signs over as they passed and injuring pedestrians. So really a safety issue there in terms of making sure that there was no injury caused by signs that were overhanging footpaths. And in Melbourne, what we see is that signage has generally followed our pattern of development. So in the early days of Melbourne's boom, thinking kind of in the early 1900s, signage predominantly was found along our rail lines and at our railway stations. So you can see in the images that are on this slide, on the left-hand side, we've got a billboard from the 1940s that abuts a rail corridor, advertising or promoting a radio play that was on 3AW at the time. And then if we go to the bottom right, we see signage at Spencer Street Station in the 1940s. And you can see what most of that signage is advertising is really business identification and directional signage at the time. The top right image is a little bit later. That's from the St Kilda Junction in the 1960s. And as we progress through Melbourne's development in the 1940s and the 1950s, we start to see more freedom of movement in terms of people being in their cars and able to move along arterial roads. And this starts to set out the golden age for outdoor advertising. And if you think about what the difference was between then and now in terms of our media landscape and our advertising landscape, opportunities to grab people's attention to sell a message was largely restricted to newspapers and being outdoor and seeing outdoor advertising. While there was some radio advertising, it wasn't as extensive as you see now in terms of ad breaks kind of punctuating every radio segment every 5 or 10 minutes or so. So as far as businesses were concerned, the best chance in terms of advertising spend was in outdoor advertising, because more people would see it as they walked past. It couldn't be avoided, it couldn't be blocked out, it couldn't be switched off. And in fact, that's still kind of the marketing mantra that outdoor advertising uses to this day. You can very easily change the TV channel, or if you've recorded a TV show, you can skip the ads. But you can't block out or avoid an outdoor advertising message if you're out and about in the city. And again, these images kind of show Melbourne's development. So the two images on the left are signs that were quite prominent in the 20s, 30s and 40s along parts of Melbourne, where different businesses would both advertise their business, but also some promotional materials such as tea. Alcohol was another brand that was often associated with these kind of wall signs that were painted to the side of businesses. And the image on the right-hand side kind of shows that we're looking at King Street here, and you can see that as you progress up William Street. As you progress up William Street, what you're seeing is this predominance of outdoor advertising. Again, some business identification, but starting to see more promotional material and the use of public space, such as the viaduct for the train line, for promoting outdoor advertising. As we move into the 50s and the 60s, what we start to see is new technology emerges, and electrical signage becomes the norm as Melbourne starts to catch up to international trends that were seen in the 20s and the 30s overseas. The image on the bottom right here is again the St Kilda Junction, and you can see the change that's happened at that junction between the previous image and this image over the space of a few short years. Signage starts to follow our road corridors more prominently as cars change movement patterns, and the opportunity for that advertising message to be seen moves beyond rail, essentially. And around about the time of the Olympics, what the image on the right is showing is this trend towards electrification and neon signs. And that continues right through to the 1970s, where neon becomes this massive craze in terms of signage, and also tri-vision. So the image on the right is Young and Jackson's Hotel. And what you can see is that this continuing journey of signage technology changing the display of signage in our cities. Probably a consistent theme that you're seeing through these images is that progressively over time, the advertising message is getting more cluttered, and you're seeing more of the exterior of built form, particularly in commercial environments, starting to display ad messages. And like our built form, as I've just been highlighting, signage evolves over time. So all of these photos are of the Young and Jackson's Hotel on the corner of Flinders and Swanston Street. And what you can see is that there has been a predominance of signage on that building for quite some time in various different forms. And that you can see in the image on the top left that most of the building was covered in some form of signage. The same continues with the image in the middle top there. And then progressively that kind of clutter and display over Young and Jackson's Hotel has been refined. Sure, signage is still very predominant, but you can see that that message has started to slowly become restricted to one message that sits atop the building, rather than this kind of clutter of imagery all across the wall of the building. And that kind of clutter message that I was mentioning is not really a new planning problem. In fact, kind of peak outdoor advertising and the kind of peak of the golden age for advertising was really in the 70s and 80s in Australia. And it's something that Robin Boyd talks about in The Australian Ugliness, which is that there was this proliferation of signs in some urban situations that created an eyesore and a substantial detriment to the visual environment. You saw signs competing for attention that would kind of cancel each other out to the point where none of them could be appreciated, and also created this kind of ugly and oppressive visual clutter. And the image on the left is from Sydney. We like to pick on Sydney as Melburnians, so I've deliberately chosen a Sydney example here, and you can see that there's this very extensive visual clutter to the point where it's very hard to be able to discern any one advertisement from the next, and the signs are indeed kind of cancelling each other out here and you can't appreciate them. So this is the kind of visual clutter curse that our planning system is trying to avoid in our regulation. You see it in clause 5205 and certainly in a lot of local policies. But when you think about visual clutter, I want you to think about images like the one on the left here, because what you can see here is that this clutter is probably different to the clutter that we're experiencing today. And in part, the move away from the really dense clutter that you see in the image here is probably partly due to our planning regulation, but it's also due to regulation from the market and the industry itself. Operators really want to put distance between their signs to ensure that their messages are not competing with other messages from their competitors. And if you think about the way signs are now, and I don't have a slide on kind of freeway signage, but you can see the distance of signs along freeways. While they are quite predominant along our freeway and arterial road corridors, there does tend to be space between them to ensure that they can be read independently. So compared to these photos, what we're seeing today is fewer but bigger signs, and our planning system's views on clutter are really designed to avoid the danger of clutter that you see in these kind of images that are on the screen now. And this was kind of the end of the golden age for outdoor advertising. Television and more commercialisation in radio and eventually internet advertising has led to outdoor being a declining share of ad revenue. Of course, today most ad revenue comes from the internet, but nevertheless, it's still an important part of the advertising market. And John's going to talk later about how our planning system regulates that in a decision-making framework. And despite all the clutter and despite all of the negativity around our signage, some of our historical signs have remained iconic, and indeed some of them are on the Victorian Heritage Register. So we know that like our built form, some of our signs have shaped our development and our urban fabric, and we value signs like the Skipping Girl sign, like the Nilex plastic sign, the VB sign that sits just behind it, and other signs as well. And again, this kind of is a mix of both business identification sign, but also to some degree promotional material as well. And that kind of nostalgia for signage and historic signs is starting to see new life, with hand-painted signs making a bit of a return, starting to see signs like those on this slide throughout Melbourne. And these are all by one particular signage operator who has very particularly chosen to do these hand-painted signs to kind of have a bit of a retro feel and appeal about them. And signage is a big commercial enterprise. It's probably being hit really hard now by restrictions in Melbourne and around Australia, and certainly some of the figures that were out yesterday tend to show that the advertising market and revenue from outdoor advertising is down about 60 to 70% at the moment. But it also generally has been a bit of a recession proofer for advertising, and certainly the experience of some outdoor advertisers I've worked with has been that, for instance, when the when the economy is lagging and you're having trouble getting construction up for commercial buildings, for office space, etc., that there are kind of increasing there's increasing interest to outdoor advertisers in terms of maximising land values through outdoor advertising. You can see here that this is a sign that's on a wall along Flinders Street, right near Young and Jackson's, and in 2015 that wall ad space was sold for over $3 million. So it's a very lucrative market, and certainly landlords are looking for opportunity where they're along arterial road environments to capitalise on their land value there. And that kind of moves along to a consideration around what our planning scheme says around signs. And what I want to highlight to you is that different signs have different impacts. And of course, we know that there are various sign terms that are used in our planning scheme and in the language in clause 5205 in particular. And I want to highlight to you that different policies, particularly at the local level, will require signs to be assessed in particular ways. And that means that we need to think about what the land use, what the signage terms actually mean for particular sign outcomes, because there can be a grey area between some definitions. There can be overlap between definitions too. And it's important to appropriately define signs so that they can be adequately assessed. For instance, there's a pretty big grey area between what's a promotional sign and what's a business ID sign. So business identification is, of course, really about the identification of a business, and the definition of that says that it can include the name of the business, the nature of the business, and its logo. But many business signs you'll see along our shopping strips also include a promotional element to them, and they'll promote goods or services or an event. And in Category 1 signage areas, they're still Section 1 signs, so they don't need a permit. But as you progressively move through the signage categories, promotional signs become restricted. And of course, if that promotional material is over 18 square metres, it's a major promotion sign and needs a permit in all circumstances. So it's important to think about the content and the message that you're seeing in signs because it changes the way in which you would assess the sign. And touching briefly on a few examples, one that doesn't get a lot of attention is an above veranda sign, and it becomes relevant under a lot of heritage policies in terms of discouraging above veranda signs, but not all signs that sit kind of at a first floor level are above veranda signs. So you can see that it has to be more than 3.7 metres if it's not attached to a veranda. So if you're looking to sign in a context of a heritage streetscape, your building might not have a veranda, but it's not going to be considered this kind of above veranda sign in the context of heritage policy until you start to get above that kind of 3.7 metres. And then again, in terms of whether a sign's animated or it's electronic, this is an issue which has really started to emerge over the last kind of 7 or 8 years as outdoor advertisers move more towards electronic signage. And most of the digital signs you see in Melbourne and around Victoria are electronic signs. But there is some confusion because a digital sign can change its message, but that doesn't necessarily mean it's animated. The definitions here are probably not helpful in that regard because they do kind of say that an animated sign can change its message, but an electronic sign can be updated electronically, but it doesn't say it can change its message. So it's an issue where we see that our signage terms aren't adequately defined and don't adequately deal with this kind of change in technology over the last kind of 7 or 8 years. That said, it's probably generally difficult these days to find an appropriate location for an animated sign, particularly in a vehicle-based environment. And there's probably only a few spots where I've been able to see animated signs, like the one on the left here, which is in Burke Street Mall. And also illumination impacts the way a sign is illuminated impacts the way in which illumination is felt by the surrounding environment. So light spill, for instance, is something that will change depending on whether a sign is internally illuminated or floodlit. Where that light spill occurs is influenced by the way in which the sign is illuminated as well. So floodlit signs, often the light spill is more towards the rear of the sign, and that might impact surrounding residential environments. Whereas internally illuminated signs and electronic signs, the light spill is predominantly forward of the sign and usually towards a commercial environment. The final part of the sign I want you to think about is whether it's a high wall or a sky sign. And so they are different types of signs. And you might also think that the image on the left is a pole sign, but a pole sign is restricted in its definition to something that's a lot shorter than this sign and is probably not as wide as well. So sky signs can include signs which are sitting at the top of a building. If they are on the wall of the built form, they can also be considered a sky sign where they project above that wall. Whereas high wall signs are signs which sit below the parapet of the building, but must be more than 10 metres above the ground. And as you start to put all this together from the definitions in the signage terms, you can see that there's not one part to a definition of a sign, that they all kind of, there's usually 2 or 3 parts to a signage definition. And when you're reading the regulation at clause 5205, and when you're reading policy, you need to be thinking about all the component parts of a sign, that it's not just a major promotion sign, that it's could be an electronic sign, it could be a major promotion sign, it could be a sky sign. All of those parts will influence your decision making, particularly in terms of local policies, which may talk about where major promotion signs are discouraged or where sky signs are encouraged or discouraged, etc. And when you get into that regulation, you start to think about whether a sign is a use or a development, when is a permit triggered under the planning scheme. And it didn't used to be as clear cut as it is today. And so signs are both a use and a development. But this is something that was before the tribunal in 2010. And if you looked at a planning scheme in 2010, there was no land use term for a sign. And the permit exemptions for signage were listed under buildings and works. And the Planning and Environment Act defined development as including constructing or putting up for display a sign. So what the tribunal said in 2010 was that based on that reading, a sign was a development and it wasn't a use. And then the Supreme Court later overturned that decision by saying that the tribunal had placed too much emphasis on the words in the planning scheme around signage being development and the fact that there was no land use term for sign, and not enough emphasis had been put on the words that were in the Act. So while constructing a sign was development, the Supreme Court also noted that the use of the land included reference to the use of land for the purpose for which land has been developed. So there was a direct connection between the development of the land and its subsequent use. It held that a sign could be considered a use and that signs can accrue existing use rights, at least in part and in some circumstances. And that's something that is being borne out in many tribunal decisions of a recent time, is establishing existing use rights for signs. And many signs that have predominated in an urban landscape since the 80s and were constructed at a time where they probably didn't need planning approval. And you're now starting to see that there's enforcement action on foot as to whether these signs are legitimate, and establishing existing use rights is a way in which those signs can be legitimised. The planning scheme has fortunately since become clearer. Sign is now a listed land use term at clause 7303, and clause 6201 universally says that the use of land to display a sign doesn't require a permit. So from a planning permit trigger point of view, a sign is development, and it is the action of constructing or putting up for display a sign, which aligns with the language that's in Section 3 of the Planning and Environment Act about signs being part of a development activity for the purpose of regulation. There's a note in 6202-2, and you'll see on the slide here that the second dot point exempts signs from requiring a permit under buildings and works permit triggers unless specifically required by the planning scheme. And how that plays out is that, of course, you see that clause 5205 says a permit's required to construct or to put up for display a sign. And the heritage overlay in the capital city zone also includes similar permit triggers. But a common misconception is that overlays like the design and development overlay trigger a permit for a sign under the buildings and works trigger. It actually doesn't, because of the operation of 6202-2, because it needs to be specifically identified under the permit trigger within that clause. The tribunal's been very clear on this in recent years, and some of the Knox decisions that John's going to talk about a bit later, although not in that context, do draw up this discussion around the DDOs. So what the DDO can do is it can introduce a different category for signage to the requirement that's in the zone, and that's in the DDO template that's in the ministerial direction. And a final note on permit requirements for signage is that the permit trigger for development for the buildings and works does include the structure on which the sign is mounted. So there's no other trigger under the scheme. So again, if you think back to the DDO, you think back to the zone, there's not a separate permit trigger for the structure that the sign's mounted on. The sign does include its structural components, and that's been established by the tribunal as well. So that's the framework for when a permit might be triggered under the scheme and whether it's a use or a development. I'm now going to hand over to John, who's going to really take you through how you might exercise your discretion and assess a sign.
Thanks, Matt. That was really interesting. The historical images of Sydney and Melbourne were certainly revealing of a different type of built form environment than I think many of us might be used to if we drove through some of those cities today. Partly, I guess, those images have informed some of the industry's current position in relation to outdoor advertising, and indeed that of society. And in doing the research for this course, it's not hard to find quotes from notable people expressing a particular view one way or the other about outdoor advertising. And this one I couldn't help but repeat and put in the package of materials today. This is from our former Prime Minister, Paul Keating, who was approached by the Sunday Age about outdoor advertising, having formed some views and publicly expressed those on the topic previously. And his view is that signage is the graffiti of modern commercial life that was ruining Sydney. Now, there may well be that may well be a bit of a reach to blame the ruination of Sydney on outdoor advertising, and I think perhaps he might be somewhat hyperbolic in those comments. But nonetheless, he characterises outdoor advertising as being the growth of that industry as being in direct proportion to the decline in civic amenity and quiet enjoyment of the landscape. Now, he goes on to say, the outdoor advertising industry is in the business of professional ugliness, ripping directly from the public domain assets that are then folded into its wealth. They are generally able to operate under the radar screen. The industry's game is a bit here and a bit there, where no one project produces a groundswell of objection, but where, over time, its activities succeed in marring the whole environment. Well, now, those comments are certainly pretty alarmist, aren't they? And capture your attention much in the same way, perhaps, that outdoor advertising does. The comments expressed by our former Prime Minister have perhaps evolved from some of the textbooks on architecture and urban design that we as professionals probably read as part of our undergraduate studies. Matthew has already taken you to Robin Boyd's seminal book, The Australian Ugliness, but another book that if you haven't read, I would urge all planners to get their head around is a textbook called Learning from Las Vegas. This is a very well-known, and again, I would say seminal piece of literature on city planning and urban design, where a couple of academics used the streetscapes of Las Vegas as the basis for a research project. And of course, what better place to look at when we're commenting on things like advertising signage. Now, for Boyd, the root of the problems with Australian urban architecture and urban placemaking was around our fascination with featureism. And in Boyd's view, featureism is the unrelenting practice of emphasising the redundant and needlessly embellishing anything that stood still. In saying that, Boyd was really hitting out at treating architecture much like cake decoration. According to Boyd, this scourge of featureism can be found in architecture or in the planning of cities or the design of magazines, espresso bars, neo signs, motor cars, gardens, crockery, kitchenware, and everywhere between. Now, Learning from Las Vegas is written after The Australian Ugliness, but it takes a somewhat different and perhaps less doomsday vision of the evolution of modern urban environments. Written by Robert Venturi, Denise Scott, and Stephen Eisenhower in 1972. Learning from Las Vegas really talked about the concept of a city as being a set of intertwined activities that form a pattern on the land. Venturi, Scott, and Eisenhower introduce the concept of the duck, which is the special building that is a symbol, and the decorated shed as the conventional shelter that applies symbols. And they basically characterise all buildings and structures within an urban environment as being either the duck or the decorated shed. They claim that most buildings are mainly ducks, expressing their abstract forms, ideas about utopianism and modernity despite their best efforts to appear neutral. And they contrasted this to the architecture of Las Vegas, which is mainly made up, in their view, of decorated sheds. These were low, wide buildings to which signs and symbols are applied. And they discuss how Las Vegas is part of a new urban landscape because it is the architecture as related to the highway, the truly modern way of travelling. And they explain at length how Las Vegas's architecture, symbols and signs relate to the function of the city and how it both delights inhabitants as well as serves a purpose. And in that kind of academic framework, then really, I think we might be able to appreciate the role that outdoor advertising signage plays within that broader urban landscape and within that mosaic of experiences, visual images and symbols. Venturi, Brown and Eisenhower raise concepts that tend to challenge aesthetic orthodoxies. Instead of clutter, they posit the idea of variety. They also identify buildings as signs, and in that respect, I think we can point to a few of those in our own landscape too, can't we? Think KFC, think the Pizza Hut buildings and their B17 barn-shaped profiles, or of course the ubiquitous Maccas on every main street and corner. Venturi and Scott and Eisenhower really imagined large signs as sculptural or pictorial elements in the streetscape. And they also looked at signage in the concept of a three-message system. Signs might be heraldic, that is, the sign dominates the view. They might be physiognomic, that is, messages on a building, or they might be locational, where certain signs are located in space. So it's interesting really, I guess, to perhaps think about signage in a different way other than perhaps Boyd did, in terms of it perhaps being contributing to featureism and creation of ugliness. But perhaps sometimes the view might be that signage actually has a different role in the urban landscape, and it plays that role for better or ill in making up the complexity, diversity, vibrancy and interest of our urban areas. Now, in that space, though, planning schemes have typically taken a different view, haven't they? Many of our signage policies are really founded on the concept of the city beautiful movements of the 19th century, and no doubt our signage policies perhaps have more in common with concepts of the garden city than they do with Venturi and Brown's view of a modern urban landscape. In a very real sense, policies in planning schemes adopt a less is more approach to signage. But really, is that approach that is less is more helpful in understanding the contribution that signs make to the urban landscape and the way in which we're meant to assess them as planners? In the case of Mannion and others, and Monash, a 2012 case, Member Keeney really made an observation, I think that's a very fair one, about the position that planning schemes take about advertising signage. And that really is that signage should be generally discouraged. And in particular, in the city of Monash, Member Keeney said, it also rests on the assumption that major promotion signs in Monash should usually be rejected. And Member Keeney was reasonably critical of that approach, saying that in a free market and a competitive commercial environment, advertising has a clear space, a clear place. In that context, signage has some role to play. Now, Member Keeney went on to say he thinks it's an acceptable strategic position for councils to identify where it might encourage or discourage signage for a variety of reasons. But it is another thing altogether to effectively prohibit a form of advertising that is otherwise held to be acceptable in our community. And so certainly, I think Member Keeney was picking up on a trend that perhaps started even before Robin Boyd's assessment on featurism, but has continued to the present day. So as planners, really, we are not meant to be perhaps quite as hyperbolic and emotional as our former Prime Minister Keating was in his fairly strident assessment of the disbenefits of outdoor advertising to our urban environment. Instead, we're guided by the content of the planning scheme, and the most obvious clause for us to look at is clause 5205. Certainly in the outdoor advertising signage assessment process, I think it's fair to say that major promotion signs are the most contentious aspects of the signage matrix. Nevertheless, though, that form of signage has been and remains a significant part of the character and development of our city. Local policies typically will discourage the display of large format signs like major promotion signs, and very often too the approach of us as statutory planners is to use policies as a form of regulation, particularly around the growing medium of electronic signs. That said, Clause 5205's language is actually facilitative of signage, certain types of signage in the right locations. So 5205-6 sets out a number of locational principles for the location of major promotional signage, and they are that signs are encouraged in commercial and industrial areas provided they complement or enhance the character of the area. They're encouraged in areas with a strong built form character, where they are not dominant elements in the streetscape, and discouraged in forested or tourist or scenic routes or landscape sections of freeways, open space reserves and corridors and waterways, or areas where they will form a dominant visual element from residential areas within a heritage place, or where they will obstruct significant view lines. In terms of a good starting place to understand the Tribunal's position, we'd probably encourage you to have a look at the Tribunal's decision in IOM Proprietary Limited and Knox City Council. It's a 2014 decision of the Tribunal, and it takes the view that proposals for signage should be viewed from a neutral rather than a negative point of view. That typically signage is placed in prominent locations because the whole purpose of signage is that they're designed to be seen and to attract attention. The tribunal said that as a matter of principle, it cannot be fairly said that signs reduce visual amenity and that they are a legitimate commercial activity. The tribunal went on to say that they can serve an important function in our urban areas, that a critical element of any major promotion sign is of a scale, form and location that is appropriate to the context of the existing physical environment, and that a sign must be consistent with planning policies guiding future development and have regard to potential amenity impacts on surrounding uses. Now, in that policy space too, it might be appropriate to look more broadly beyond just the policies that might affect signage, but to other urban design or placemaking policies that might sit within the planning scheme. In terms of modern signage, there's a couple of things that are emerging, I think, that are really requiring us to learn new skills. These are things around how signs are illuminated, the emergence of digital signage and how messages transition, the consequential traffic safety implications of that new form of that new medium, how signage might integrate with its host built form and its surrounds, and those locational principles for where that type of signage should be located. In terms of illumination, well, I'm not a lighting engineer, but there are some things, there are some messages I think around this that we need to understand. So when we're talking about illuminated signage, there is two considerations. One is luminance, the other is illuminance. Now, illuminance is really a measure of how much the incident light illuminates the surface, and that's measured in lux, or lumens per square metre. To give you an idea, full daylight has an output of about 10,000 lux. An overcast day would have a lighting output of about 1,000 lux, and full moon, that is moonlight, would have a lighting output of about 0.1 lux. Luminance, on the other hand, is measured in candelas per square metres, not lux. And it's really a measure of the luminance intensity per unit area of light travelling in a given direction. It's really meant to be a subjective measure, a measure of the subjective impression of the objective luminance measurement standard, essentially what the eye would see. Now we'll see a lot of illuminated signs in the landscape, and these are some signs that are lit by LED lighting. And the purpose of these is, a feature of these signs is that they're quite different from our old floodlit signs. So what you can see is that the light levels adjust during the day and night, obviously, depending on the background level of lighting. And of course, in that bottom image, in that image on the far right-hand side of the screen, you can see that as you get to the side of the signs, the lighting output of the sign is quite restricted because we're not seeing the full face of the sign. So the viewing angle changes the perception of lighting of those types of signs. The Department of Transport is clearly interested in the lighting output of signage as well, but they're also interested in the case of electronic signs, the dwell time of the message to ensure that drivers are not distracted by that change of message. And they will place conditions on signage, on electronic signage around dwell time, anywhere from 20, 30 to 60 seconds, as well as imposing veiling luminance requirements about the lighting output of the sign and the luminance levels of that sign when seen by the human eye. When we are talking about integrating signage with its surrounds, we really need now to think about a couple of key terms, and the tribunal's posted a number of decisions which are helpful to decision makers to understand what this means. So when we talk about clutter, which I think is a very misused term in the context of signage in the urban environment, we understand that clutter is a conceptual context. It's guided by policy rather than being an absolute numerical proposition. So there will be some circumstances where you would expect to see a proliferation of outdoor advertising, and others will be quite the contrary. And in that situation, it's really not a question of how many, rather, but what the policy settings of that area would expect us to see. Now, we understand too that clutter is linked to order or disorder. And a question that we should often ask ourselves in that assessment is, would the sign be disorderly or out of place? And in that conversation, I'd urge you to read the Tribunal's decision in Kashinda Proprietary Limited and Whitehorse City Council. The other thing that we're frequently asked to assess these days too is not only the signage itself, but how the sign projects to the viewer, that is the sign panel, but how the sign is viewed at the rear of the signage structure, and whether any measures need to be taken to clad the signage structure and the other plant and equipment that might be necessary to illuminate the sign. And for that sort of discussion, you might have a look at the Media Proprietary Limited and Port Phillip City Council VCAT 480 for a discussion on that topic. But perhaps the key question is really, how does the signage and the signage structure respond to its place and its surrounds? In particular, the Tribunal has issued a number of decisions recently involving the City of Knox around broader aspects of policy, and not just signage policy, on how the signage and the signage structure will respond to the sensitive landscapes, in this case of the Dandenong foothills. And relevant cases here are drive-by developments and Knox ×2, and Maple Media Proprietary Limited in Knox, and they're cases that our office was involved in on behalf of the City of Knox. We would urge decision makers to consider what the locational principles of Clause 5205 mean in the context of the broader consideration of landscape and placemaking principles that are expressed in the planning scheme. Now, fundamentally, the question is this an area where the form of signage that is proposed is encouraged by 5205? Now, what the Tribunal has said in Reconcile Proprietary Limited is that if these principles are met, then perhaps an assessment against local policy might not prove to be all that helpful to decision makers. All right. Well, now what we'd like to do, Matt and I, would be to turn the session over to our well over 100 participants and see whether there's any questions or comments that they would like to share with us before we wrap up today's proceedings. So, audience, over to you. Any questions or comments you'd like to direct towards either Matt or myself? And please use the Q&A function to do so. Matt?
Yeah, one question that has popped up already, John, is in relation to signs for the sale or letting of properties, and they're generally exempt from needing a permit under 5205, provided they're removed within 7 days after the sale. And the question that arises in the chat is some land sales, some projects are selling step by step for a long period of time, and is there any way in which those signs can be limited?
Perhaps not through the planning scheme. Perhaps that might be an issue that the council, if they felt strongly enough about it, it might be more of a local law matter. Matthew, what do you think?
Yeah, I think that's probably right, John, although it will depend on what the content of the sign is as well. I think particularly in a land sales type environment, there's a bit of a grey area between the component of the sign or component of any signage that is about the sale or the letting of the properties, and the component that's actually promotional about that kind of land sale and property. So I think there's a point there where you'd need to look at what kind of message was being displayed on that signage, and if it probably goes beyond the pure sale of the land, then it's probably more of a promotional sign.
And Matt, I particularly like this comment from Jennifer. Where do you draw the line between graphics and signage? And we had this conversation, didn't we, as part of preparing this presentation? What's your view?
Yeah, it's a really tough one, Jennifer, and you're probably seeing it on a number of shopping strips where you've got some signage, but then you've got graphics. You've got people rolling around on the grass, somehow linked to the corporate identity of the business. This is something where decisions of the tribunal have fallen different ways on graphics and signage, and again with the return of hand-painted signs and graffiti type art that you're seeing on the side of buildings, it's something that is certainly a really big grey area, and I think some of the decisions of the tribunal have really fallen in terms of a consideration of is understanding those graphics part of understanding the corporate identity or the promotion that's linked to the message that's being put in the sign, and if it is, then it's definitely part of the sign. And then that goes into a consideration as to what is the size of the sign. Is it a promotion sign or is it a major promotion sign if it's over 18 square metres? So it's a grey area in terms of what 5205 says at the moment, and that probably doesn't really help decision making, and is probably something that needs to be tightened and corrected. And probably is also worth highlighting that there was an advisory committee on advertising sign provisions way back in 2007 that hasn't made its way into changes into 5205 just yet, but it was trying to address this and other issues coming out of the confusion in the signage provisions.
It's those lifestyle images that you see on the front of buildings are certainly becoming more commonplace, aren't they, Matt?
Absolutely.
Any other ones, Matt?
There's a question from Nicole as to decals and flags and easily removable signage. I presume that's in the context of are they regulated by 5205?
Well, you can't stop flying the Australian flag. I think that's illegal, isn't it, Matt? What do you think?
Yeah, so the signage provisions don't regulate the flying of the Australian flag. John's right about that. But again, decals and flags, to the extent that they might be a promotional image, can be considered to be a sign if they don't benefit from the exemptions at 5205.
I mean, the other sign that I see perhaps more visibly in the urban environment these days, Matt, is those removable signs that are towed behind Vespers.
Yes.
And I dare say they escape consideration under the provisions of Clause 5205.
Yeah, they certainly do. And the other thing is that, you have those signs that sit on the back of trailers and then end up out the front of a bulky goods place that might be advertising a promotion they've got on for the weekend that just pops up for the weekend. They would ordinarily need permission under 5205, but I'd imagine a lot of them either escape getting that permission or think it's easy to ask for forgiveness if somebody does complain.
Matt, I'm conscious of the time, and I think we probably need to wrap it up in order to meet our obligations to Charlotte around timing. But before we do that, I'd like to thank you, Matt, for your assistance today, and thank our more than 100 participants in today's session. We very much value your attendance. We hope you've enjoyed today's session. Please make sure you stay glued to the ADDO website for our upcoming programs and events. We hope to run more of these sessions throughout our public health emergency. It's a great way to reach out and stay in touch with each other, and we really enjoy doing it. And remember too, that special offer for the next 10 participants that book a course will receive placement into our new ADDO coach program, which we're about to launch shortly. Matt, anything to finish off with?
That's all from me. Thanks everybody for attending, and Charlotte's highlighted in the chat, but if we haven't answered your questions, we will be answering them on the website. And so if you've got any questions that you haven't put up yet, just send an email through to us through the website as well. But thanks for your attendance today and really appreciate your time.